AQUAPLUS are a beloved visual novel and RPG developer. They're known mostly for their light-hearted franchises like To Heart, as well as fantasy epics like the Utawaremono series. However, they are also known for their more serious works, such as the White Album series, alongside many other, more obscure titles. Now, I've made my love for White Album 2 very well known on this channel, alongside my overall positive thoughts on White Album when that came to Steam last year. However, a third title, also developed by AQUAPLUS in 2003, shares many of the same themes as both games, yet is largely forgotten. This game, Tenshi no Inai 12-gatsu, aka Teninai or December When There Is No Angel in English, recently got an English fan translation patch in 2024. So naturally, as a massive fan of White Album and AQUAPLUS alike, of course I was going to check this game out, and I'm going to tell you all about it in this video. First off, a little disclaimer, this game is an adult only release. There has never been any kind of all ages / console release in Japan, so that means, first off, if you're a kid watching this, sorry, but you need to grow up a bit before you can read this game. Secondly, I usually avoid adult only titles for multiple reasons, some of which I will touch on later in the video because Teninai shows why. If this game was available in an all ages form, I would read that version. But you gotta play with the cards you're dealt with, even when it means tolerating adult content. So, with all that said, let's get straight into it. AQUAPLUS released Teninai at an odd time in their history, following the company's rise to prominence in the 1990s thanks to influential classics like Comic Party, To Heart, and of course, White Album. AQUAPLUS fell into a slump. For multiple different reasons I won't go into here, much of their fan base turned on the studio. This changed AQUAPLUS forever. In the early 2000s, AQUAPLUS dabbled in whatever they could to stay afloat and spread risk outside of the adult PC market they originally found success in. This included developing the wholesome action RPG Tenereza for the original Xbox, their own micro console, which I'd love to own by the way, and even ran their own restaurant chain around this time. They also continued to release adult PC titles, the most notable of which is the original Utawaremono in 2002. Teninai was another one of these games. Developed by AQUAPLUS's Touko office, Teninai is the second work by Miyake Shosuke, who previously worked on Comic Party. He also went on to work on Tears to Tiara's scenario, as well as some roots in To Heart 2. Teninai is by far his most somber work. In this world, you experience the story through the perspective of Tokinori Kida, an antisocial high school student who is quite pessimistic and empty. He frequently smokes on the roof of his high school building with his friend Isao Shimamura. One day, one of his cigarette butts falls off the roof into the hands of Touko Kuihara, the main heroine of this story. She's a shy, timid, empty person who yearns to prove herself to the world and find meaning in her life. Kida and Touko eventually began talking and soon enough have sex. Touko yearns for a relationship with Kida, whereas Kida tries desperately to avoid one. This marks a turning point in both their lives, and depending on their choices, others around them too. This unhealthy dynamic between Touko and Kida is the crux of Teninai's story, as both characters fight internal battles. This, of course, comes with a massive list of trigger warnings which I'll go into before diving into this story's themes later. I do want to highlight the other characters first before I do this though, such as Touko's best / only friend, Shinobu Sakaki. Shinobu fills the roles of both class president and Touko's loyal protector. She can be quite short-tempered and serious, but very loud and outspoken when she wants to be. Maho Hazuki is Isao Shimamura's girlfriend, who is very energetic, upbeat and sporty, but can also be quite selfish and thoughtful. Yukio Shimudera is another student at the same school who is highly respected and admired by other students. She is quite a loner and exhibits a mysterious aura. She also works at the same cake shop as the protagonist. The final heroine, Asuna Asao, is another colleague at the cake shop. She is very amicable, kind and supportive, but also surprisingly timid. Overall, this is a nice range of characters who form Teninai's core cast. Alongside Isao, the side cast also helps bring the world to life, the most notable example being Tokinori's little sister, Konami Yasuhara, Emiri Kida. If you've played other AQUAPLUS games, you will notice similar character designs. Mitsui Misato and Takeshi Nakamura worked on Teninai's character illustrations together, alongside many other AQUAPLUS games, including the more recent console titles localized by Atlus USA. As always, their art is distinctively memorable, helping build the simple yet effective atmosphere required to carry this game's story. The same applies to the CGs. There aren't many outside certain you-know-what scenes, but they are very well drawn. All four composers, Shinya Ishikawa, Junya Matsuoka, Kazuhide Nakagami and Naoya Shimakawa, should all be familiar names to AQUAPLUS fans. Teninai's soundtrack is simple yet effective, with guitars and piano making up the majority of melodies you hear throughout this adventure. It's both somber, yet optimistic and dramatic when needed, as you explore a world that is fairly safe and ordinary in terms of its setting, yet the circumstances that follow Kida and Touko around are quite high stakes in comparison. And when I say high stakes, I really mean high stakes. This is a good time to move over to the trigger warnings because I can't really go into further details on Teninai without doing this first. You may have already worked out some of them based on what I've said so far, or what you've heard elsewhere, but it's time to blow the casket wide open. This list is so long that I'm not even going to bother making 30 images to transition each trigger warning, so I'm just going to put everything on screen at once. Mental illness, depression, anxiety, self-loathing, suicide, suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, bullying, trauma, infidelity, self-harm, death wishes, violence, restraint, blood, sex between high schoolers, prostitution, rough sex, sex in public, sexual assault, rap, masturbation, sexual degradation, domestic violence, smoking, discussion of animal death, the burial of a dead dog, unintentional negative reaction to a lesbian kiss that could be seen as homophobic. Yeah, I didn't really know how to sum that one up, and I will talk about this later. Yeah, Teninai is heavy. This game is hard to read. It's not for the faint-hearted or even someone with a strong stomach unless they really play a lot of adult titles. Out of all of AQUAPLUS's titles currently available in English, this one is by far the darkest and most depressing. Yep, even more so than White Album 2. Yet it is because of how dark Teninai gets, this game can tell a thoughtful, intriguing story that sticks with the reader long after you play it, in a way that neither White Album game can. All of Teninai's cast are mistreated and traumatised people, whether by the main protagonist, each other, or even third parties. Nobody is morally clean, everyone is a mess, which in many ways reflects the real world around us. Now I've put down the trigger warnings, I can now elaborate freely, and when I say freely, this will include spoilers. Unlike my video on White Album Memories Like Falling Snow, I found that game relatively easy to talk about spoiler free. This is because White Album is quite a simple story to discuss at its core. Teninai, however, is a lot more complex to talk about, even more so than White Album 2, and definitely more than most other visual novels. I cannot talk about how strong this game's story is without spoiling it, as well as its weaknesses. Plus, given this game's age and short length, I think being spoiler heavy is the best direction to take here. However, I will have a spoiler free conclusion at the end of the video, including my thoughts on the game and Teninai's legacy, including why I believe this game can work in an all ages form. Please use the timestamps in the description so you can skip the spoiler section if you don't want to see it. So, let's get straight into the analysis. Let's start with the main protagonist, Tokinori Kida. Now, I'm going to be very frank, out of all three protagonists in AQUAPLUS's Nakage titles, Tokinori is the least likeable. Some things he says and about other characters, but especially Touko, are genuinely disgusting and horrifying at times. While some people will criticise Haruki Kitahara from White Album 2 for being unlikable and treating his love interest like shit, nothing he does comes close to anything Tokinori says. Kitahara's views towards all the women in his life, alongside Toya Fuji from the original White Album, come from genuine respect. Not so for Tokinori, whose treatment of women differs depending on his relationship with them before the game starts. Touko faces the brunt of Kida's mistreatment because he only sees her as little more than a fuck buddy. He frequently degrades her with ableist slurs, blatantly wishes death on Touko multiple times, reinforcing her negative self-image in many other ways. Kida is the textbook definition of a walking red flag. Throughout Teninai, Kida does somewhat grow as a character because he accepts he hurt Touko and seeks to amend things. Hence the soul-searching journey mentioned in the game synopsis. Kida acknowledges the deep emptiness and dissatisfaction he feels with his life. He's unlikable because of how he treats other characters, but you also sympathise with him to an extent. This is due to the various monologues that outline the deep emptiness and despair Kida feels daily, as well as his desire to find meaning in his life. He's practically undateable, and this shows in his behaviour and life of isolation on the roof of the school. That said, no well-written monologue makes up for his abusive bullshit. However, this is why he's a well-written character, even if you don't like him. He does pale in comparison to both White Album protagonists though. Touko is the main heroine in Teninai. She is the very embodiment of somebody you just want to hug and protect because you value her more than she values herself. She has such low self-esteem, she constantly puts herself down, knowingly burdens others, and is very isolated as a result. all of this is made worse by the bullying Touko is forced to deal with daily, which contributes to her anxiety and struggles to communicate with anyone. Due to all this trauma and low self-esteem, she becomes immediately attached to Kida in a very unhealthy way. She yearns for a serious relationship with him, yet she's so consumed by her desire to be loved and seen that she thinks submitting to Kida for sex is the key to building a strong relationship. Even when Kida says their sexual encounter is a one-off and is a purely give and take, she can't accept this on a deep level, especially because she senses Kida's conflicting feelings. She's also extremely submissive. It's one thing to be naturally submissive in a relationship, whether in the bedroom or not, as long as it's based on mutual respect and trust, whereas Touko's submission here is just not healthy at all. She also seems to be hypersexual. If not intentionally written that way, she's definitely coded as such. While there's nothing wrong with being hypersexual either, not being aware of it does mean you are more likely to find incompatible partners, especially if, like Touko, if you're not aware of it. Trauma can really do a lot to someone. When you combine all of this together, Touko is clearly not in a position to have a romantic relationship with anyone. It's hard not to feel sorry for her though, and it's actually quite sad seeing this dynamic between her and Kida play out in real time. It's also even worse seeing this dynamic change in other routes, as Kida loses interest and moves towards somebody else. Kida's newer dynamics, chained with the other love interests, are healthier than Touko's, but still fraught with challenges. One thing I will say is that Touko's background is never properly explored. Why does she have a deep lack of self-esteem? Is it just a bullying, or is it something else? You don't even meet her parents, which is quite bizarre given she's the main heroine. There is a scene at the end of one of the side routes where she runs into her family home, which would have been the perfect opportunity to introduce her family. Other heroines' family members are more detailed than Touko's, which is equally baffling. Moving on to these heroines now, starting with Shinobu, her friend. Yeah, you can already guess where this is going. The dynamic between Touko, Shinobu and Kida is the closest you get to those in the White Album games. Shinobu's route breaks off Touko's route in the wildest possible context, which is very, very bizarre and messed up. In a way though, this context is a natural conclusion to Shinobu's character arc. Shinobu is extremely overprotective of Touko, to the point where she's undermining Touko's personal growth, which leads to resentment between the two. Additionally, Shinobu struggles with depression and a negative self-image, making her codependent on Touko to function in the world as well. Therefore, when Touko and Shinobu's friendship breaks down in their respective routes, you see the absolutely devastating consequences of this. Shinobu's route is where this is most apparent. At one point, Shinobu ends up watching Touko and Kida have sex in the classroom. Yeah, that was a bit of a wild scene. Shinobu's mental health deteriorates significantly as a result of her own insecurities and fears relating to her own self-worth and belief, and she has failed Touko by being a peeping Tom. Shinobu believes she has to make amends for this by essentially punishing herself. This is very disturbing because it includes self-harm, as well as insisting on Kida having sex with her and degrading her. This was also wild, but also really triggering and really hard to read. It's easily the second most triggering route in the game. Shinobu already struggles with depression and other mental illnesses, so her scenes were already quite intense in the common route, and this is before her personality comes into it. One thing I will add is I love how Shinobu and Touko's dynamic shows that toxic friendships can be equally as devastating as toxic relationships, even when there's no malicious intent. This aspect of friendships is something a lot of people don't really want to talk about in real life or in fiction. Teninai succeeds at exploring this aspect, but I do question whether such an extreme angle was needed to properly explore Shinobu's character. Next up is Asuna, who at first appears to be the least traumatised of all the love interests. Interestingly, Asuna is also the most fooled with Kida out of all the heroines, and she wants him to be happy. In many ways, she's the older sister figure within Kida's world, but deep down she yearns for more. You can even go on a date with her in Touko's route, exemplifying much of her character and dynamic with Kida. Her route does get quite dark in its own way though. As Asuna's past comes back to haunt her, she tries her best to push Tokinori away, as her traumatic past controls her behaviour. There's a certain kind of trauma response, but although never mentioned in game, it exemplifies her arc perfectly. Toxic shame. That subconscious feeling that you're not good enough, that there's something wrong with you, that there's circumstances beyond your control that are indeed your fault. These thoughts are all encompassing. As Kida breaks down these mental walls, only then does Asuna begin to work towards building a brighter future for herself. She realises that Kida doesn't look at her any differently even after discovering her past, something she found very difficult to accept. Maho's route is closer to the White Album series in some ways because it does feature relationship problems, but that's about it. You see, Maho is already in a relationship with Isai, however, she's not happy, and neither is Isai. Part of the reason why is that Maho believes she and Isai are fundamentally incompatible on a sexual level. Isai is quite direct and desires sexual activity, whereas Maho is quite the opposite. This is one of many tidbits of differences, miscommunications and misunderstandings that build up over time, leading to the demise of their relationship. Throughout it all, Kida plays a supporting role, acting more like Maho's actual boyfriend to her than Isai. However, what's interesting about Maho's route is that she and Kida never become a couple. Maho sees Kida as a brotherly figure, and this never wavers, even as Kida starts to question this dynamic. In part, this is due to Maho's own trauma because she realises that her relationship with Isai is not good for either of them. This take on a love triangle dynamic is completely absent from the White Album series. In both White Album games, cheating and betrayal are integral to the game's story, whether it's the more simplistic approach of betraying Yuki by dating Rina, or Kitahara falling back in love with Kasusa, there's no escaping it. Those games build up the tension of both a blooming relationship as well as the inevitable devastation that comes when Yuki and Setsuna find out in their respective games. In Teninai, this tension doesn't exist, and it's both refreshing and engaging in its own right. Even at the end of Maho's, or more to the point, Maho and Isai's route, when Kida witnesses Maho and Isai formally break up on Maho's request, Isai himself asks Maho if she likes Kida. She says no, and that they can never become one, because that's the truth. Isai himself said in response that had Maho said yes, he would come to resent Kida, something that reminds me so much of a certain ending in White Album 2. Now I'm finally going to touch on Yukio's route, which is the most triggering and dark of them all. I highly recommend reading her route last. Sumidera is a fan favourite character among AQUAPLUS fans. Her eccentric, quirky personality juxtaposes her deep depression, making her very memorable. In fact, right up until the end of her route, Sumidera plans to end her own life at some point, and she's very open about it. She's at peace with this, and can compartmentalise her ideation in daily life. This is why she's able to perform her role at the cafe so effectively, and why she's easily able to convince Kida to form a suicide pact with her. If anything, I think Yukio's nihilism and negativity are still relevant today. As somebody who borders on being both Gen Z and a millennial, I see a lot of overlap between Sumidera's behaviour and the belief of many of both generations in the real world. There are so many reasons young people are depressed: the cost of living, the rise of fascism, unresolved childhood trauma, unsafe and insecure housing, climate anxiety. It's easy to conclude that given these and more insurmountable barriers, it's easier on the mind and body to just end it all. This is why nihilism, negativity, blunt dry humour, complete distrust and disdain for existing institutions are all popular views among younger people. It's easier to stick to our own bubbles, waiting for what we see as the end, rather than fight for something better. It's easier to isolate ourselves from caring about other people and focus on ourselves, allowing our own thoughts to consume us. However, the bond that Yukio and Kida create throughout their short time together ultimately changes Yukio's mind at the very last second. She realises that she may indeed have a bright future waiting for her after all. Realising she's not alone, she takes action, enabling her and Kida to ultimately survive their double suicide attempt at the end of her route. The idea of connections and building connectivity is one of the best things that people can do to improve their well-being, regardless of how severe somebody's mental illnesses are. Moreover, building connections and community is one of the most effective ways to fight nihilism and fight for a better future. A future where society works for all. A future where everyone who needs help and support gets what they need with no judgment or hostile bureaucracy. A future that defeats nihilism by giving people hope. A future where fewer people become mentally ill due to an often hostile world. All of this is something that I relate to a lot. While this is admittedly more of a 2020s interpretation of the work, things like the climate crisis and the harmful effects of capitalism were not as widely known in 2003, I think this perspective has meant Sumidera's route has aged much better than many realise. The other big aspect of Yukio's route relates to Emiri, Kida's sister. Emiri is gay and has a crush on Yukio, her best friend. As a result of Yukio and Kida's new closeness, Emiri becomes jealous and feels the need to confess her feelings to Yukio before her brother wins her over. This results in one of the game's most memorable scenes, where Kida walks in on Emiri kissing Yukio at a classroom table. Unfortunately, Yukio misunderstands this situation and reacts negatively, unintentionally coming across as homophobic. Even though Yukio is not homophobic, she's just not attracted to women at all and still loves Emiri as a friend, and this is made clear in the script. However, this devastates Emiri, feeling betrayed by her best friend and her brother, the two most important people in her life. This scene could have been easily quite harmful and problematic, but I'm pleased this isn't the case at all. Rather, this does reflect the reality of being queer at school in the 2000s and early 2010s, where being LGBTQ was still poorly understood in schools around the world, including in Japan. That's why this scene, and its fallout, was so upsetting. I would like to have seen a scene where Yukio and Kida properly make amends with Emiri. While text in the hospital scene on Yukio's route implies this, we don't see Emiri at all. Had such a scene been added, whether in Teninai or a future official after-story fandisc that will likely never happen at this point, Yukio's route could have been a potential all-time favourite route for me. Regardless, this was such a powerful route, and I can see now why so many people like Yukio. As you've likely already concluded by now, I am a fan of Teninai's core story and themes. There's so much to discuss relating to how Teninai explores trauma, and I've only scratched the surface. However, the main thing I've not touched on is sex, not just in terms of themes but also adult content, as I rarely ever play adult-only titles, yet alone cover them on a YouTube video. Now is a great time for me to elaborate on my own views regarding adult-only content in general, not just in Teninai, but for the whole genre. I do avoid adult-only titles for the most part. This is for two main reasons. The first is more of a personal preference. I don't like adult content in games. It usually adds nothing to the story and can often be a huge turnoff. Sometimes adult content can add something to the story and make it even better. However, this is rare, and as far as I'm concerned, authors should always be prepared to rework their titles into an all ages form, especially if they intend to remake the games in the future or bring them outside of Japan. Secondly, I'm probably going to get flamed for this, but much of the discourse and fanbase for adult Bishoujo games online is so toxic that I do not like engaging with it much, if at all. One reason why is because it's driven by a very toxic, chronically online, loud minority who put adult content on a pedestal, and I found that a lot of people have such strong tunnel vision they miss the forest for the trees. Because even if you exclude the questionable reality of depicting high school age characters having sex and various other things, the reality is adult content doesn't always enrich the experience. It's not always needed, and a romance VN without adult content is not pointless or slop. This firmly applies to Teninai. Teninai's adult scenes do not aid immersion and often break the somber atmosphere Teninai works so hard to develop. Teninai is full of gripping, powerful scenes where each core character member struggles with their own internal battles, often taken out on Kida and others around them. This simple but effective presentation, especially the music, builds a somber atmosphere that's truly memorable long after you've finished a game. However, this atmosphere is inconsistent, as it often breaks when you get to the adult scenes. These scenes include moaning and randomly deciding to have sex in public, or in the exact same hotel room Kida fucked Touko in at the start of the game. It's so bizarre, and sometimes I laughed out loud, effectively overriding the build-up from before. This laughter is partially down to anxiety because, again, adult content of this nature makes me uncomfortable, period, but also because it's just bizarre on its own merits. And I don't mean bizarre in terms of the actual content, they are vanilla. It's a complete tonal shift. Teninai's adult scenes often feel forced and exist to fill the criteria of being a quote-unquote leaf adult game. Furthermore, many of the adult CGs are recycled throughout the game on different routes too. This isn't building intimacy, even if Shosuke intended it to be. The thing is, I'm not the only one who even feels this way. Even back before AQUAPLUS began leaning exclusively into the console market in the late 2000s and early 2010s instead of their Leaf brand, the company developed a sizable audience who prefer versions of their titles with erotic content removed, or instead play Leaf titles for their gripping stories and memorable characters, with adult content merely being a bonus if it fits at all. People like me, essentially. As time goes on and both AQUAPLUS and the visual novel industry grow in the West, it's clear this mindset is becoming more popular and even dominant for certain demographics. For example, a quick look at Teninai's V&D page shows multiple people skipping the adult scenes in English patch, hence their playtimes are even shorter. I also think cis heteronormativity also partially explains the toxic attitudes I've outlined earlier. As somebody who plays visual novel games of all genres, I have noticed a huge difference between Bishoujo games and otome games. The former is driven primarily by sexual content and aesthetics. This reflects a lot of attitudes that cishet men internalise from a young age, due to society being so heteronormative, and why you see so much backlash against the idea of bishoujo games being anything other than this. This includes dropping adult content. On the other hand, otome games are primarily driven by non-sexual romance and personalities, which reflects the comparatively more open, healthier, and nuanced understanding of society women are more likely to have. Obviously there are exceptions to this trend of course in both titles and individuals, but you get the idea. I also see reflections of modern dating culture in Teninai's story. The majority of younger people are isolated and largely have to rely on dating apps to meet romantic partners. And even then, many people aren't looking for anything serious or long term. Instead, more people seek short-term gratification, whether it's sex or companionship. Part of this is due to the pressures of society, but part of this is also down to people having more agency, especially cis women and trans non-binary people. Teninai could, and should, have been even better had it been written as an all-ages title, or at the very least, have an official all-ages version written later on for consoles. I have seen claims around the internet that a console port of Teninai was planned at one point, most likely for the PlayStation 2 and or the PSP. However, I couldn't find a concrete source. I do believe this is possible, given that Kizato, another popular Leaf title, was also slated and cancelled for PSP at one point. Teninai's fantastic pacing and emotional tension would be consistently maintained in such an adaptation. At the end of the day, when people think of visual novels, even adult stuff, they don't think of how good a character fucks. They think of the gripping stories and narratives that surround these characters and the journeys they go on, especially in more depressing, somber titles like Teninai, White Album 2, The Shade Evermore, Slow Damage, and so many more. I believe it would be possible to rework the game's story into an all-ages form with minimal changes. You'd need to draw a few new CGs and move some of the story and relevant text. However, everything else can be removed entirely. The White Album remake is a fantastic example of how to remake an adult-only title into an all-ages game while retaining its somber yet bittersweet atmosphere with some sexual content. I do believe AQUAPLUS are more than capable of doing it should they ever return to this game later on, especially given the recent 2-part remake announcement. So, what is the legacy of Teninai? AQUAPLUS themselves, despite never re-releasing the game, still look back on it fondly and even reference it at times. Takeshi Nakamura released a new illustration to celebrate the game's 20th anniversary in 2023. Moreover, Teninai has a prominent spot on their recent 30th anniversary trailer and promotional material that, if like me and you've watched their streams, you've probably already seen a million times already. Fans who've played Teninai also remember the game and look back on it fondly. Due to the age of the game, a lot of Japanese VN readers have read the title, both in and outside of Japan. One of Yukio's CGs is referenced in the 2022 title Needy Streamer Overload, showing Teninai's impact in popular culture. The most obvious example of Teninai's legacy though is, well, White Album 2. White Album 2 borrowed elements from both the first White Album game and Teninai to create what is widely considered to be one of the best visual novels of all time. While the original White Album and White Album 2's writer, Boruto Fumiaki, are credited as the main inspiration points, Teninai is the unsung hero. You cannot appreciate White Album 2 without playing Teninai and seeing what it brought to the table back in 2003. One of White Album 2's cover albums also features official covers for Teninai's opening and ending themes sung by Asuna's voice actor Yonizawa Madoka. But even if White Album 2 didn't exist, Teninai holds both a unique legacy and a unique identity. It represents AQUAPLUS' experimental era before they found their way again the following year with 2 Heart 2 for the PlayStation 2. It represents Sosuke's desire to create something different and memorable from his prior work. Most notably though, Teninai represents a unique discussion on heteronormativity and various sexual and romantic expectations in relationships, a discussion that's aged incredibly well and is more important today. I believe Teninai benefits more as a standalone title unrelated to the world of White Album than had it actually been a White Album title. The dark, triggering nature of much of the game's story, alongside the lack of an all-ages release, mean I can't easily recommend this game outside of people within the visual novel genre. However, that doesn't detract from being glad I could check out this forgotten classic within AQUAPLUS' library. I recommend jumping on this fan translation patch if you're interested, because AQUAPLUS is unlikely to re-release Teninai anytime soon, although, for the record, I really hope they do. I'm going to close this video out in true Teninai true ending style by reminding you of the following lines. It is not eternal. It is not the truth. It's just a feeling that's there.